My voice barely left my throat before I heard the crack. It was small at first, an almost polite sound from the rock, a grinding like a fingernail across glass. But in that thin air at the edge of the overlook, it arrived sharp and honest. Henry's boot slipped. He went forward like a man cut from the line, arms fishing at nothing. For a breath I thought he would snatch the rail and find his balance. He did not. He went over. Then another sound, closer and harder. The dull, brutal thud of someone pushing into weight. My shoulder took most of it. I hit the stone, and the world narrowed to pain and bright sky and the smell of earth. I remember thinking, with that terrible clarity you get when your body decides the rest of you can keep working, that this wasn't how accidents happen. People fall, railings fail, wind can be a thief, but accidents don't have signatures. This did. The bolt at my hand felt loose when I grabbed for it, not snapped but worked, worn, as if a wrench had been used and the thread left sloppy on purpose. The railing leaned a hair too far. Gravel at the edge had been scattered in a way that suggested traction had been reduced deliberately. Rachel was at my grandson's side, but her hands were too calm. Marcus was pacing back a few meters, eyes sharp and clinical, like a man watching a timer he'd set himself. I dragged air into my lungs and tasted metal. Henry's shout cut through me. "Grandpa," and then a soft, controlled voice near my ear. "Call 911. The words were what people say. But Rachel's voice had a practiced tremor, a performance designed for witness. Marcus didn't look at Henry. He looked at me, calculating, as if deciding what the math would be when the body was taken care of and the paperwork completed. I used my left hand to pull my collar open and saw blood where the fabric rubbed. Nothing dramatic to look at. Bruises, a cut along the temple, but enough. Enough to make them think I'd be slow, that the old man was broken and distracted. That was their miscalculation. "They're cut loose," I said, voice low. "You two did this." Rachel snapped her head at me, surprise then quick anger. "Don't," she spat. "You're bleeding, you should be on the ground." "You put Henry in a position to fall," I said. "You loosened the bolt, you put him next to the gap." Marcus's jaw tightened. He told me Henry had stepped back when a loose stone gave. He argued the physics, the inevitable. He tried to make it simple, a neat story. He always tried to make things simple when the numbers didn't favor him. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked. "Because the bolt's been tampered with. You listed Rachel as beneficiary on a $2 million policy last month. The policy was taken out. That's none of your business." Marcus interrupted. "That's private. Not when someone's life is on the table." Rachel's face changed then. Not the grief she showed Henry, pure, practiced, but something colder. For a breathing second, she was someone else. A woman who'd watched the arithmetic of other people's pain and decided it fit her plan. Marcus tried to reach for Henry as if to steady him, but Henry's eyes were wide and searching, and he pushed Marcus's hand away. He looked at me with a look I had seen in battlefields and in barracks, the look of a good kid trying to measure right from wrong under pressure. I had options, mostly ugly ones. My life taught me there are always choices when someone you love is in the balance. I had friends who would have told me to make the world simpler. I had a friend named James who ran a private security outfit and wouldn't ask questions about methods, but I don't work that way. The law is messy and slow and imperfect, but it is where we send our grievances. It is where we have to let justice work, even when our hands itch to take faster measures. So I did what I had trained a life to do. I held the moment together, kept my voice steady, and reached for the redundancy we'd stitched into our days. I pushed my thumb along the seam in my coat until the little device clicked. It was small as a matchbox, ugly and purposeful. Henry's breath was coming shallow and fast. I flicked the switch and spoke in a low, clipped voice, not to the people around me, but into the plan. "Beacon on," I said. The phrase meant nothing to Rachel and Marcus. To them I was an old man fumbling with a gadget. They saw a flash of blue light, brief and unremarkable. Marcus grinned, half relief, half contempt, as if the old toys had nothing on his spreadsheets. "You can't do anything from here," he said. "There's no signal up here." I had heard that before. No signal up here are the words everyone utters when they think phones are lifelines and they don't know about the work that goes on beneath the surface. I wasn't relying on a cellular lifeline. I had layers, a satellite check-ins, a short-range transmitter, a prearranged call to the sheriff if I didn't check in on time, contingencies, redundancies, habits. Someone needs to understand what my words meant, because those moments were where everything turned. I was not the soft target they assumed. They thought I was just an old man. They were wrong. If you want more true life survival stories, subscribe. Later, when the court papers described what we did as improbable, and the reporters tried to file the scene into tidy little categories, grateful grandson, villainous girlfriend, cold-blooded partner, I wanted them to know what the edge of that cliff felt like in the seconds before the beacon carried our location to someone who could help. I wanted them to understand the view from a mind that didn't panic, that kept counting steps and options while your body screams. That morning, the plan had been simple. A hike to the overlook. A picnic we had promised Henry after he landed a small promotion at work. A chance for the two of us to get away from the city noise. Rachel had joined them. I had no reason I couldn't see for myself the dynamics. I had watched them for weeks, small things, not stalking but attentive. My stint in Army intelligence taught me to watch patterns. After you study patterns, anomalies are as loud as fire alarms. Rachel and Henry met at the cafe 4 blocks from my house. He introduced her that afternoon, easy and proud. She was charming, earnest in that way people take to charm. I liked her at first. Who wouldn't be drawn to someone with quick humor and a hand on a plate reaching for good manners? Love and charm are not crimes. What tipped me was 2 months later when I learned a life policy for Henry had been issued in Rachel's name. $2 million is a tidy figure. It doesn't ring like a bell until you look at context. Bills, loans, Marcus's small business where Henry had gone to help out part-time, Rachel's sudden interest in more extravagant things. It wasn't enough to accuse, it was enough to watch. So I watched. I noticed Marcus and Rachel arriving to the house in the same car more often than coincidence would allow. I noted when Rachel began steering conversations about life insurance and beneficiary clauses into the open, always lightly, always casual, as if normalizing it would dissolve any skepticism. I asked Henry once gently, did he have a policy? Did he name anyone as beneficiary? He shrugged and laughed it off. It's a weird thing to tell your grandfather, perhaps. He was 25 and immortal in that sense. He didn't think about it the way I did. I told James what I saw. James is practical to the point of bluntness. He listened, then built solutions in his head the way a carpenter enumerates tool choices. He didn't promise to fix things with boots and threats. He knows the law and rides the thin edge between protection and provocation, but he did help me arrange the tech I would need if the worst happened. Phones, an emergency beacon tied to my account, a short-range radio that could punch through low-signal areas, and a check-in schedule with Deputy Miller at the county sheriff's office. Miller had been a neighbor to the family for years. We had a standing agreement. If I didn't call in by noon on certain days, Deputy Miller knew to check in. He liked the old ways. He appreciated the exercise of being there for people whose world had bent unexpectedly. There is humility in preparation. There is also a bitter taste to it. You prepare because you love. You prepare because the world is indifferent to the small lives you care for. The difference between being a prepared person and a paranoid one is what you do with your knowledge. I chose to stay within the lines of law, but I also chose to be ready to call for help in the exact moment reality narrowed to possibility. That morning at the overlook, the weather was thin and bright, the kind that makes your skull ache with sun. We parked at the lot and walked the path that dips out of town and into the scrub. The trail gives way to a ridge with a view that seems to pretend to hold the world. The railing at the edge had been installed years ago, and I had leaned on it a dozen times. It felt old and familiar, a place where you could put your hands and breathe the valley in. It had been weakened, not old with age, but with intention. A bolt meant to hold steady had been worked. I told myself I might be wrong. I told myself 1,000 small, comforting things to avoid blowing apart a family. But my instincts are also built by long service. They are muscles you don't wish to use unless the situation calls. When Henry slid, my hand went to the railing and felt the evidence. Your hands tell you things that your head can rationalize away, but your hands are honest. "Call 911, Rachel said finally, her voice now pitched to the public. She spoke as if she had been brave all along. Marcus was already moving toward the car like a man who had rehearsed exits. "Don't touch anything," I told them. "Deputy Miller will be here. The beacon sent our location." Marcus laughed. It came out like a dry thing. "A beacon? You think you're on some spy movie, old man. We can be gone before he shows." "You're the one who underestimates time," I said. "Time is a soldier you can't bribe. You can only count on its inevitability or be crushed by its patience." Marcus looked at the car keys in his hand and then at Henry, and there was a flicker of something like uncertainty. People who plan crimes are often meticulous, but the calculus of real life, the vulnerability of a breath, the way someone who loves another will bark commands that make no sense, is not tidy. It was in that wobble that I found my leverage. I had Henry's eyes on me. He was bleeding from a head scrape but coherent, telling me his name, telling me that he felt okay. He said things like, "Grandpa, it's fine," because he thinks himself tougher than he is sometimes. I told him to breathe. I told him to think of the grocery list. I used the old tricks. He smiled once despite it all, a little ridiculous thing that cut straight to the heart. Young men sometimes process fear with a laugh because they haven't yet learned the weight of silence. I knew I had to keep the two of them talking, which is what you do when you want to make a liar reveal himself. Liars hate silence. It's a simple rule. So I spoke to Marcus and Rachel, asking small questions and letting their answers trip. I kept my hands where someone could see them. I kept my voice steady. I needed the deputies to see behavior, to get a body of evidence that wouldn't be untangled later as mere suspicion. "Who benefits?" I asked, not rhetorically. Rachel's hand fluttered to Henry's shoulder. "I'm listed on some paperwork," she said, "but that doesn't make me—" "It puts money in play," I said. "2 million. That's a motive." Her face went taut. Marcus's jaw worked. He decided then to try a different tactic: minimize, obfuscate, spin. He tried to steer the story back to a tragic accident, a freak misstep, a tragedy for which no one deserved blame. It was the oldest line in the playbook. It is the line men like him count on, because juries like to be given simple tragedies rather than human math you can't solve with pity. I had been preparing for that line. James had given me a list of things that made a narrative tell on itself. Timing, beneficiary changes close to death, altered physical evidence, hurried exits. We had prepared a little kit of photographs and notes. I had taken pictures of the railing the week before when I first noticed the loosened bolt. They were in my pocket, printed out, low-tech evidence for a high-tech problem. People always assume photographs are digital, and therefore manipulative. Physical prints carry a weight of intention. "You took pictures," Marcus said, eyes narrowing. "You were watching us." "I was watching the railing," I said. "You'd been here enough." The fear in Rachel's eyes flashed and receded. Something rational in her mind must have whispered that we still had options, that trying to finish what they'd started might be a bad business move, that we could still make the accident narrative hold. Marcus, being a numbers man, did mental arithmetic. Had they allowed Henry to fall and die, they'd have gained their payout. If they fled now with witnesses, their chances dimmed. If they tried to run and were caught, they'd have more to answer to. Life is very practical that way. They made a move, simultaneous and instinctive. Marcus reached backwards for the glove compartment where they'd stashed something small. He wasn't subtle. I couldn't see fully, but I recognized the motion of someone closing a tab they'd meant to conceal. I slid my hand to my collar and palmed a second switch I'd hidden there. It was a short-range transmitter James had set up for me. Not a weapon, not a trick of force. Just a small radio with a squawk and a line that could get attention in rough places. "You don't understand who I am," Marcus said then, the first clear admission of threat in his voice. "You think you're some—" He stopped, searching for a slur that fit my age and stature. "I'm a grandfather," I said, "and that's the most dangerous thing you'll meet today." He laughed, a brittle sound that hid more fear than he wanted to admit. "All right, old man, make the call." I didn't make a call. I set the transmitter to send a coded ping that James and Deputy Miller would recognize. The beacon sent a satellite burst. The radio squawked in a low, ugly way. Those were small sounds to people who didn't know what they meant, but they tore the calm from Marcus's face. He had counted on slowness. He hadn't counted on a system of small redundancies. He hadn't counted because who would? People like us learn small things. How to watch for patterns, how to create backups. It's boring work, too boring to comfort the conscience, just practical. I watched their faces as the consequences of their choice arrived in incremental blips. A text from Deputy Miller confirming our last check-in time and asking if everything was all right. A notification from the beacon service that a distress ping had been acknowledged and logged. The physics of a crime you plan on paper rarely hold against the logistics of being alive. Marcus swore under his breath and cursed the angles life had put him at. He started toward the car. Rachel, seeing the countdown in his eyes, began to look genuinely panicked, as if the story they'd written for themselves had become a play with no exit. "You're not taking him anywhere," I said. My voice was a beam that I hoped would reach Henry and steady him. "You're staying right here until the sheriff gets here." Marcus stopped and looked back. For a moment, there was indecision. He is, in the small amount I know of him, a rational man who makes calculations that he intends to never regret. But real people are messy. They have conscience even when they try to forget. He rubbed his temple, a tiny sign of stress, and then reached too casually for the passenger door, as if to rescue Rachel from a moment of collapse. He was moving when I made myself speak in a voice he couldn't shrug off. "You're on camera," I said. I pulled up the little printed photos from my pocket and threw them at his feet. The pictures were small and not pretty. Close-ups of the bolt, the scuff marks on the paint where a wrench had been used. I tossed them like a gauntlet. He looked down. Rage flared. It was a dangerous thing to see, someone who had planned but not been entirely immune to fear. He grabbed the papers with a frown and stuffed them into his jacket in a move that was as useless as it was instinctive. "You do this. You cause more trouble for yourself," I said. "You run and you'll have what you ran with. Evidence. Witnesses. You stay and you have a chance." He hadn't planned for chance. He had planned for certainty. Rachel screamed then, a high, sharp sound that made the birds in the scrub lift and settle. "Marcus, please," she breathed. "We can explain this." He didn't. Her voice broke in a way that sounded made. It did not move me the way a true plea does. It was a layer of soap on the surface of things. Marcus moved faster. He shoved Henry backward and grabbed him under the arms. Henry didn't fight much. He was stunned. He had blood at his temple and the world had shifted under him. He couldn't see the calculations Marcus did. He saw only the practical. Someone taking him. The car keys, the world narrowing. "Stop," I bellowed, an old military reflex to use authority when words won't do. Old men can often surprise people by roaring when required. Marcus froze, hands on Henry, and there was a sliver of time, too brief for comfort, where I considered the options that had always been there if you let your hands close around the rulebook. I kept my voice tight. If you move him, I will call the sheriff. I will tell them what I saw. I have evidence. You will be stopped. This isn't a negotiation. Marcus looked at Henry, then at me. He smiled in a way that broke my hands into cold. You're bluffing, he said. Try me, I said. It was an invitation, not to violence, but to the system. I would not open a book of revenge. I would open a book of law. He made a split decision to pull Henry down toward the car. That's when something else happened, something neither of them had planned for. The short-range transmitter James set me clicked again, a different tone. The beacon app defaulted to a louder alarm, and a voice repeated something clinical into my ear. Emergency beacon activated. Location transmitted. I heard it like a distant bell. Marcus glanced at me, panic finally bleeding into his face. He looked at his watch. He looked at the road. He looked at Rachel. He had calculated speed and distance, and the likelihood that our small community could follow a radar they hadn't even known they needed. That was when he saw the patrol headlights, a single dot at first on the winding access road. Deputy Miller is a man who runs toward an exercise when other men run from them. He takes his job personally. The dot grew into a presence, halogen cutting the morning into slices. Marcus cursed and made for the car with Henry. He shoved Henry like a thing he resented being soft in the wrong place. I took a breath and pushed on the thing I do best, set people to account. Deputy Miller's here, I said, and let irony take its place at my lips. He's been notified. Marcus snarled and ripped the car door open. Rachel was already scrambling in. They slammed the door, and the engine growled like some animal with teeth too big for its mouth. The car backed out, wheels fighting for grip on the gravel. It wasn't a clean getaway. They fumbled. They were a little too fast, a little too raw. The sound of them leaving ought to have been relief, but it wasn't. They had taken Henry. They had not finished what they planned, but they had him in a car, and the sound of an engine is the last thing a human hears before a scene changes. I heard Deputy Miller before I saw him. He burst from his vehicle like a man who had been waiting to be useful. What happened? He barked, hands on his side. He was the sort who speaks in orders, not questions, which is what you want when you need help. He arrived at a run, radio already crackling with dispatch. He looked me over quick, saw the blood, saw Henry's splayed form on the ground, and then his eyes went to the road where the car was disappearing. They're leaving, I said. He has them. Miller didn't hesitate. Go with me, he said, voice iron. Get in the cruiser. Tell me everything. I wanted to stand and argue, to list it all out slowly, the policy, the bolt, the way Marcus's jaw worked. But action is the enemy of delay. I swore softly and pushed myself up. The pain was there, a steady, complaining thing, but it was manageable. Henry looked at me with a mixture of apology and surprise. Grandpa, he whispered, I'm sorry. You're alive, I said. That's not something to apologize for. Miller's cruiser turned onto the road, and we followed at a distance, close enough that I could see the other car pull into the highway. The world narrowed to the two vehicles and the thin strip of asphalt. I reached into my pocket and found the envelope with my printed photos and the notes I'd scrawled. I shoved them into Miller's hand. Deputies call it chain of custody later. In the field, it's the only way to make your thinking physical. He looked at them and cursed softly. Stay with Henry. I'll radio it in. Call James, I said. He knows both of them. He'll get ahead and look for the exit patterns Marcus would use, and call the sheriff. Tell them we have reason to believe this was premeditated. Miller's jaw tightened. You trying to make me obsolete, old man? I smirked, despite the blood. Just making sure the paperwork matches the body. He grunted and drove like a man with a purpose, lights intersecting morning like truths that can't be ignored. As we moved, my mind went through the ledger of decisions. You don't arrive at 70 and a lifetime of service without learning to let the big things be the only things you worry about. The big thing now was Henry's survival. The rest would be handled by the people with badges and cases and courtrooms. But there was another ledger, quieter and more private. The one where you tally what you did to prepare and what you could have done better. You ask yourself if the preparations you made were noble or foolish. You ask whether watching your grandson count as love or as suspicion. The truth is, it was both. You can be a guardian and a skeptic. You can love a man and know the cost of unchecked charm. In the cruiser, Henry kept his eyes on me. He was pale, his voice small. Why would they? I don't know, I said, but we find out. We were on the phone with James within minutes. He was quieter than I remembered in our years together, practical and without panicked flourish. He moved with contact lists and calls and simple, efficient words. If they go south, he said, they'll take the state line. Marcus hates roundabouts. He'll try to stick to the smaller roads. There are 2 exits in 10 miles, both have cameras. I'll meet you at the junction. I repeated what I could to Deputy Miller on the radio. He called in a bolo, be on the lookout, and pushed our location through the dispatch network. There are parts of the world where the machinery of order works because men like Miller take the cause personally. The system is not infallible. It is slow. It is full of red tape. But it does things. It stops cars. It ties a person to their choices. We caught a tail light in the rear view and then lost it. Then we found it again. The other car took a wrong turn and had to swing in a wide arc to set back on its path. That clumsiness would matter. I knew that in my bones. Crime is a game of mistakes. You can plan for everything, but you cannot plan for every breath another person takes. At a stoplight, the driver ahead of us glanced in the rearview mirror, then made a show of staring out the windshield, a little too pointed. People notice irregularities and try to pretend they don't. The other car's passenger, Rachel, was not a good actress when it came to stillness. She kept moving, touching the hem of her shirt, fiddling with the steering wheel. She had the look of a person with a plan trying to recompose herself. Marcus has a different kind of anxiety, oily, like someone with a calculation that loops. Miller took the next off-ramp. We followed. The car slowed under the speed limit as if it were trying to be cautious and suddenly spastic. Then the driver did something we didn't expect. He pulled into a small gravel turnout and killed the engine. I remember the way Rachel's face changed. People who plan don't always think about stopping. They think about movement. Stopping demands a different kind of boldness. They were in the middle of a decision. Marcus stepped out and walked to the trunk. He opened it as if to get a jacket and closed it instantly again. The car hummed with the low potential of a thing about to happen. There was a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath, the way it does before a judge renders a sentence, the way it does before the tide finally decides. I saw movement in his hands and Miller had already leapt out of the cruiser. He had the right of way as a deputy. He called out, voice wide and strong, "Police, don't move!" Marcus flinched. He had been expecting roads, not guns. He tossed a small package into the grass and then turned toward the cruiser in a way that suggested surrender. He wanted to appear compliant. Rachel, her hands blue with the burden of performance, sat with her head in her hands. Miller didn't run them through with commands and threats. He did the careful work. He kept them talking, asked questions, listened to the answers. He kept a radio between us and dispatch. He cuffed them with language, not with outrage. "Why did you take him up to the overlook?" he asked calmly. Rachel began to cry then. It sounded real enough for a moment. But real tears have a depth you can't fake easily. James used to say they are like rings in a tree. She had a ring, but there was no age to it. I watched Marcus while Miller took them in. He tried to be brave, that man. Tried to say they would explain, that it had gone wrong. But his legs moved like someone who has to walk over a match. "You're under arrest," Miller said. He called the charge. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud. Those words hung in the air and settled like dust. Marcus's face drained. Rachel's tears turned into the panic of someone who sees everything collapse. None of this was triumph. Arrests are not poetic. They are bureaucratic and slow and full of forms. But they are the hinge the system has, the place where chaos begins to meet the law. I sat on the curb with my hand pressed to Henry's shoulder and waited while Miller read them their rights. There was a small private victory in seeing the handcuffs click, not because I enjoyed it, but because it meant that the story wouldn't be theirs to finish alone. Henry looked at me then, big eyes misty. "You saved me." "I had help," I said. "You saved yourself by being alive." He managed a laugh that was all breath and relief. "You were right about everything." "Don't make a habit of listening to me," I replied, wryness returning like a salt I can't shake off. "But pay attention." They took statements and photos. They took samples and catalogued our clothing. It was all very procedural, very slow for the heart. The ambulance came and we sent Henry in for a scan that turned out better than I dared hope. A concussion, a few stitches, a bruise behind the ear. Not fatal, not lifelong. Just enough to remind him he was fragile. A detective named Alvarez arrived with gloves and a crispness to his motions. He walked the scene and asked questions as if he were unrolling a map. He pointed to the bolt, then to the scrape on the rail. He looked back at me and asked me to repeat what I'd said. I repeated it plainly. Nothing dramatic. He nodded and wrote it down. "We have to be careful here," he said. "We can't jump to a narrative online. We have to prove a case." "I'm not asking you to jump," I said. "I'm asking you to look." He did. He ran the photos and the evidence, took statements from witnesses, and put it into that slow machine called investigation. Marcus and Rachel were taken to the sheriff's office. They had little to say that wasn't self-serving. But the evidence was there in small things. Witness statements, the photographs I'd made, the satellite log that showed a beacon ping at the time Henry fell. An insurance agent, one of the dry, efficient professionals who hate drama, checked policy records and found the beneficiary change a few weeks before. Small things, strung together, make a rope. Night finally came and the lights of the precinct buzzed like a city of tiny judgments. I sat with Henry in the hospital room, the fluorescent overhead making his freckles look like constellations. He slept in fits, and I watched him breathe. The world is a strange place to parent when your child grows up to have children of his own. You still feel the old fears with the new humility. You feel both the angel and the debt. I thought of James, who had sat in his truck with a thermos and silent support until the deputies let him in. I thought of Miller, who had gripped my shoulder with the steady honesty of a man who knows his duty. I thought of the things that had led me to that day: training, suspicion, love, and stubborn refusal to close my eyes and wait for fate to write an ugly sentence. There are other things to consider. The press would come. The trial would take time. The prosecutors would want more than my printed photos. They would demand a narrative that fits in a courtroom and not all of life does. There would be cross-examinations that would poke at motives and call me a meddling grandfather. Marcus's lawyer would try to make the evidence of the bolt mean nothing. They will try, as the defense always does, to pull at threads until doubt pollutes certainty. But none of that mattered in the bright pause after the arrests and before the courtroom. What mattered was that Henry lived. What mattered was that the family could breathe. What mattered was that the law had the chance to do its job. I sat by a hospital window and watched the valley darken. The cliff that had nearly taken my grandson lay silent and patient. In my pocket was a roll of notes, a reminder of a life spent preparing for outcomes most people don't even think to guard against. I have been asked in the days since whether it changed me, whether the moment at the rail turned me into someone harder, more cynical. I don't think it did. I think it made me a better teacher. Henry would have to decide what to do with what he'd been given. Time, survival, and a sightline into the dark, tactical choices people can make when they see money as an answer to emptiness. I would help him, sure, but he had to choose for himself whether to be fearful or prepared, stunted or strengthened. Part of a grandfather's job is to offer the tools without handing over the sword. That night, as the machines beeped slowly and the hospital staff moved like quiet ghosts, I wrote the first list of what would be needed. Names, dates, photographs, witness accounts. I wrote things down not because the law needed them immediately, but because a clean mind loses less blood than a chaotic one. When the legal world takes over, order helps. In the quiet, I thought of the phrase that had become a knot in the throat of those two I arrested. I'm not who they think. They had assumed what old men are: slow, sentimental, defenseless. They had failed to measure history. My years in service grafted into me the habit of assuming nothing and preparing nearly everything. That doesn't make you superior. It makes you weary and stubborn and sometimes ridiculous, the kind of man who keeps a small beacon in his coat pocket and a list of contacts in his glove compartment. I will tell you now, plainly, I am not who they think. I'm older, yes. I'm not a stranger to caution. I have spent a life learning how to keep facts together and how to let justice do its work. I do not relish violence. I don't want revenge. I want law. I want Henry to live and to learn how not to be naive in a world that sometimes trades on small hearts. Which is why the next morning I called James and asked him to help with Henry in a different way. Not with a gun, not with threats, but with instruction and mentorship. Henry needed skills, yes, awareness of surroundings, the ability to take basic precautions, but also a path that would turn the fracture into something like purpose. James runs a consulting firm that trains people in protective detail. He knows how to teach people to read a room without seeing the room as an enemy. He knows how to make someone able without making them hard. Henry needed that. That day, before the press released their version, and before the attorneys began their slow, patient work, I sat with Henry and told him the truth of the thing that had kept me alive in places where people don't make small mistakes. Planning helps, and love makes you plan even when it's unpleasant. He listened, sometimes flinching when the memories of the fall came up, sometimes quiet and thoughtful. He asked for no vengeance. He wanted to understand. He wanted to learn. We started, in the hushed hours between medical tests and whispered calls from detectives, to plan small lessons. Not the kind that teaches you how to strike or how to hide, but how to be seen and counted. How to create check-ins. How to make one's life less like a loose bolt and more like a structure with redundancy. He wanted to work, he said. He wanted to make himself useful to others who couldn't watch as carefully as a grandfather could. I told him he could do better than watch. He could teach. There are things to do before you let an ugly story go to court. Gather the facts. Write them down. Keep your temper. Don't act as prosecutor. Let the legal process do the legal work. And yet, don't be so polite as to be passive. There is a balance that must be struck, and you learn it by making decisions in the small hours when the heart is raw. We had not yet talked about what would happen to Marcus and Rachel in the months ahead. The arrest that morning had been a beginning, not an ending. The questions would stretch out over weeks and then months. Depositions, subpoenas, interviews repeated until the edges of the story were smoothed into legal language. We sat through interviews with a kind of private exhaustion. Henry in for scans and therapy sessions, me in conference rooms with a detective who liked to fold his hands and look at you like he was sorting proof into neat piles. Detective Alvarez kept his voice even and his notebooks full. He was methodical. He did not need theatrics. He only needed facts to line up. They began to line up. The beacon log that had felt like a private miracle that morning was a chain of time-stamped entries in a server somewhere. The prints of the photos I had shoved toward Marcus became formal evidence. Miller's radio traffic was pulled and archived. Small things. That week's purchases. A sudden beneficiary change, a string of text messages that, when collected and placed beside one another, looked less like affection and more like arrangements, took shape in the hands of people who made cases for a living. Marcus and Rachel had different faces in custody. Marcus kept a kind of brittle control about him, the type of man who believed if he could manage the narrative precisely, he could bend the consequences. Rachel alternated between a performance of grief and a muted, frightened anger. They tried to deny the obvious in the interviews. They spoke of a tragic accident. They pointed to the slip, the weather, the possibility that their hands were clean because bad things happen. Defense attorneys are craftsmen of doubt. They build small question marks into the shape of truth and hope one will swallow it whole. At one point, James sat across from me in the tiny visitors' room in the county lockup. He had that habitual, almost clinical composure he brings to every problem. A thermos, a list, plans. He looked at me and said plainly, "If the law doesn't get you what you want, there are other ways." He didn't have to describe them. I knew what he meant. I know men like James. I have been a friend to them, and I have been saved by them. He has my gratitude and my trust. But when he said it, something else inside me tightened. "I won't do anything outside that line," I told him. "You know me. I respect what you do, but I respect the law more here. Let it do its job." He nodded slowly. Disappointment and respect tangled together. "Understood," he said. "I'll help where I can. I'll keep an eye. We'll be quiet about it." He meant he'd watch for practical things. Phone taps, surveillance, legal support. None of it crossed into the kind of blind justice I had refused. It was the difference between protecting and avenging. The prosecutor we were given was a woman who had the bruised patience of courtroom vetting. She had a way of making simple sentences compound until they were impossible to shrug off. Her opening statement at the arraignment laid out the bones: premeditation, motive, the policy, actions taken to create the accident. She did not need to be dramatic. The facts were already dramatic enough. The defense tried an old gambit. Paint me as an interfering grandfather who wanted answers and let suspicion be mistaken for proof. They implied, gently, with the professional sneer of the legal profession, that an old man had invented motives to patch a narrative to his own fears. The prosecutor countered with small, stubborn things: camera logs, radio pings, printed photos I had taken before the day at the Overlook, witness statements that matched the story of a loosened bolt, and best of all, the single piece of evidence that turned the case from possibility to proof. A recorded interrogation clip from the booking room that the sheriff's office had captured on body camera. It was not a confession in any cinematic sense. Marcus did not rise and proclaim guilt with flourish. But in the raw, stripped-down tape, there was a series of exchanges in which he nervously explained a plan to someone off-camera, then faltered and named the beneficiary change, then muttered a comment about making it look like an accident. It was small talk that read like a blueprint. The defense tried to argue he had been pressured, misquoted, taken out of context. The prosecutor played the clip in the courtroom for the jury and let it speak in its own dull, horrifying way. The trial had long pauses and short, blunt moments that still sit with me. There were opening statements where a man's voice reads the bare facts, like a Bible, statements that feel like the first day of a weather report announcing winter. There was the moment when the prosecution brought up the beneficiary change, and the policy papers were held up to the light of the courtroom like a piece of evidence in a museum. There was a string of witnesses, the insurance agent, dry and professional, who explained how such changes were logged and how rare it is for someone in their 20s to have a life policy amount so high. A neighbor who testified he'd seen Marcus and Rachel arrive early the morning before the hike and lurk. The technician who confirmed the beacon's log timestamps, Henry testified. I thought about that more than anything. Whether a young man should be asked to stand in public and tell strangers about the moment someone pushed him. Whether the courtroom is a place that heals. Henry sat in the witness box with a bandage at his temple and a quiet dignity that made my chest burn. He described the morning simply: his fall, the feel of the bolt, the hands that tried to steady him and the ones that shoved. He did not act like a hero. He was honest, and he was bruised. The defense tried to unsettle him, to suggest memory is unreliable after a concussion, to prod at the gaps and the stumbles of human recall. Henry, with the sort of clarity that settles my own heart, answered plainly and then said something that everyone heard. "I don't know why they do it. I know what happened. When I took the stand, I spoke slow and exact. I am not a man who relishes testimony. I have stood in front of many things in my life, but the courtroom is a place where words are measured and then measured again. I described what I had seen, what I'd taken for proof. I explained the pattern of behavior that had led me to watch, how James had helped me set up contingencies, how small redundancies had saved us that day. I resisted editorializing. The judge does not want speeches. He wants facts. The jury does not want sermons. They want an understandable story. The defense tried, with polite force, to turn everything back on me. They suggested surveillance, obsession, that I had an agenda. They asked whether I had ever considered James's methods to be too forceful, whether I had ever wanted to lash out and fix things myself. I told the jury what I had told James in the holding room. I refused to cross that line. I had options, but I chose to use them as ways to ensure evidence and life, not to make myself judge, jury, and executioner. I said plainly that I had taught Henry to prepare himself, not to strike at others. The most uncomfortable hour came during cross-examination, when Marcus's attorney tried to paint me as vengeful, an old uncle who wanted to control his grandson's life. They asked me if I had ever asked Henry to change his plans to avoid Rachel. I told them yes, I had asked. We argued like family sometimes. I had questioned his choices and watched his company. That did not make me an arbiter of fate. It made me a man who had loved someone enough to care what could happen. One piece of evidence the prosecution used to stitch motive and means was the text messages that had been pulled from Marcus's phone. They were short and prosaic in isolation, but when laid out they read like a shadow script. Discussions of beneficiaries and numbers and timing, they were never explicit threats, but the implication was there, a calculus where money entered the space that should have been kept for care. The defense argued those messages were innocent, professional talk between a boyfriend and a business partner. The jury had to decide whether a pattern was coincidence or design. At the end of the trial, the prosecutor gave a closing statement that did not rely on melodrama. She asked the jury to look at the small things and see the whole. The beacon that saved a life, the photos, the texts, the recorded statements, the actions on the day in question. She reminded them that the law exists to aim at truth, and that truth rarely slams you over the head. It arrives in increments and then demands a decision. When the jury left, Henry squeezed my hand so hard that my knuckles ached. We waited with a peculiar, patient terror, the kind that is dull but constant. Waiting for a verdict is something the body knows as a long tightness in the chest. You try to fold the world into small tasks. I found my fingers tracing the grain of the courtroom chair like knots on a rope. They came back with a verdict for both defendants, guilty of attempted murder and fraud. The judge read it slowly. Marcus's face went the color of a man who had been forced into the sunlight after a lifetime of calculating in the dark. Rachel's hands went to her face and she sobbed. Not all cries are the same, and some are more for what is lost than what is admitted. There was no applause. There was, for me and Henry, a release that is less triumph than the lifting of a weight. They were later sentenced, held accountable in ways the law provides. I will not exaggerate the numbers here. Sentences are the province of judges and the particularities of statutes. The important thing is the outcome. The legal system moved through its slow, imperfect gears and produced a result with consequences. It wasn't revenge. It was function. The men and women who had helped us had done their jobs. After the verdict, there was a small period when things felt soft and fragile. Henry had to rebuild not just his body, but his sense of safety. He went to therapy sessions that were quiet and difficult. He slept badly for a time. He also came to the workbench in my garage when his doctor said it was okay, and we began the quieter business of teaching him tools, practicalities, ways to pay attention to the world without letting fear run him. James' mentorship became a steady thing in his life. He did not teach Henry how to be violent. He taught him situational awareness in the way you teach a carpenter to square a board. Methodical, patient, useful. He helped Henry understand contingency planning in everyday terms, telling people where you will be, making check-ins a habit, having a chain of trusted contacts who will answer for you. James gave him a job in a training program, basic security work that emphasized service and protection rather than suspicion. Watching Henry put on a uniform for the first time was an odd mixture of sorrow and pride. He had always been my happy, invincible boy, and now he was a man who had learned the cost of not noticing. He did not become hard because of it. He became more measured. He learned to be steady. There were mornings when we went over basics like radio etiquette and simple de-escalation, things that give you options other than force. He worked with clients who needed someone who could be present without being imposing. He gravitated toward helping older people feel safer walking home from grocery stores and teaching teenagers how to check in with a buddy when they went out at night. There was something redemptive about that. He had been the mark of someone else's plan. He chose to spend his life telling others how to make different choices. In quieter moments, he would come into the garage and pester me about small improvements. "Grandpa, your beacon is ancient." And I would grumble and let him tinker. We laughed at each other's analogies, and he taught me a few new tech things I didn't fully understand. There is a long, sweet pleasure in seeing the next generation take the tools you hand them and repurpose them for good. There were questions asked of me in the press that I handled clumsily. They wanted a neat story. The grizzled veteran who saved his kin. The moral who proved that planning matters. I tried to be candid without being grandiose. I told them that preparedness is not paranoia. It's love with a plan. I told them you can be ready without becoming fear-based. I told them you must choose to work with the law because it's imperfect, but it's the place where a society stitches itself together. The hardest part for me was the small, private reckonings. Could I have been kinder? Was my suspicion cruel? Had I prejudged a young woman who might have been innocent? Those thoughts visited me like persistent tides. But when I saw the videotape of the custody interrogation again, when I watched the way Marcus spoke and the way Rachel arranged her grief like a garment, I saw how the calculus had been made. People who trade other people's lives for money are experts at smoothing the edges of their decisions so nobody looks closely. Evidence undoes that smoothing. Friends and neighbors offered their own judgments, some soft, some sharp. Some thanked me like a hero. Others asked why I had been watching at all. I learned to answer simply, because I loved my grandson, and I wanted to see. Loving someone doesn't guarantee you will be right. It just compels you to act in the face of doubt. One moment I will not forget. After the trial, the prosecutor came to the hospital quietly and asked if Henry might be willing to give a recorded statement for a training series the sheriff's office was putting together about recognizing premeditation in domestic relationships. He said our story could help others spot patterns. Henry agreed. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He wanted others to be safer. Months later, Henry stood in front of a small room of people, seniors from our neighborhood, college students, a cluster of parents, and told them in plain terms what had happened and what he'd learned. He did not enjoy telling it. He did it because he felt it had a use. He spoke of small habits that keep you safer, telling someone where you are going, using public meeting places for early dates, keeping a friend informed when you travel to remote places. He spoke of his surprise at how quickly friends can tilt toward self-interest. He spoke with a clarity I recognized. Survival does not belong to the hardest fists. It belongs to the prepared and the moral. There was a particular day that felt like a quiet, right turning point. Henry and I were at a local hardware store picking up materials for a workshop James and I were running for a neighborhood watch group. We had advertised it as practical precautions, and 10 people showed up that evening, women and men, kids and elders. We taught simple things: how to check a car's blind spots, how to set a check-in routine, how to document a suspicious interaction without accusing someone prematurely. The class was not about fear. It was about giving people small tools so their lives would not be left to chance. Later that night, as we packed up, a woman in her 70s came up to Henry and gripped his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping us from being afraid." Henry's face, still soft, humbled, went pink. He has the look of a man receiving a burden that is also a blessing. I cannot say the ending is completely neat. Legal verdicts close one chapter and open others. There are appeals and motions and lawyers who hunger for extra years of attention. Marcus and Rachel will live with their guilt and their choices for the rest of their days. That is part of what the law accomplishes. It leaves consequences, and it asks those who decide to make them to reckon with that weight. And for me, the work continued in other ways. I kept the beacon in my coat pocket because that day taught me the value of small redundancies. I kept a list of contacts, and I taught Henry how to keep a record of the little things that might matter in a court of law: photographs, dates, names. I encouraged him to be neither fearful nor careless. We planted those habits slowly, like seeds pressed into good soil. Sometimes, when the late light hits the workshop and Henry is polishing a piece of metal with the same careful hands he'd used to scrub bubble in a pan as a kid, I think about what I taught him without preaching. The difference between preparedness and paranoia. The responsibility to let institutions do their work, and the humility to know you might be wrong. All of those lessons sit in his hands now. He uses them to protect others, not to punish them. We did not become a family defined by the worst morning on the overlook. We became a family shaped by the decisions that followed it. To use the law, to teach, to repair. That is how the moral arc held for us. We refused to be made into caricatures of vengeance. We allowed the system to perform its function. In the end, the people who helped us, Deputy Miller, Detective Alvarez, James, the prosecutors, were the instruments by which justice, imperfect as it is, could reach us. If there's a final lesson I would offer, it is this: being prepared is not a refusal to trust. It is a commitment to love in practical steps. It is the act of leaving a breadcrumb trail for those who will need to find you, and making sure your life is seen and accounted for when it matters most. When they thought I was only an old man, they forgot to count the years of study and habit that come from a life of service. They forgot I had spent my career learning how to hold information without letting it harden into judgment. They forgot, in short, that I'm not who they think. We are not unbreakable. We are not invincible. But we are capable of dressing the world in small protections and of choosing the law when the bitter temptation to do otherwise comes calling. I did not take another man's life. I did not seek to punish outside the channels made for it. I acted like a grandfather who refused to lose a boy to calculation and instead used the tools the community gave me to keep him alive. At dusk, long after the courthouse emptied and the reporters had pointed their cameras elsewhere, Henry and I sat on the back steps of my house. He had returned from a training assignment with James and was tired in that good way, the kind of weariness that comes from honest work. He looked at me and said quietly, "I don't want to be afraid anymore, Grandpa. I want to be useful." "You will be," I said, and watched the last light roll off the valley. Usefulness is a kind of courage. He smiled, small and genuine, and glanced at the beacon tucked into his jacket. He put a hand on my shoulder, the way he had the day I pulled him back from the edge, and it felt to me like the whole point of what we'd been through. Teaching a man to carry tools without letting them become weapons. If this story mattered to you, like, share, and subscribe for more real-life tests of courage and preparation.